Greetings everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Music as a Journey in the year 2020. I'm going to start off this episode by pointing out there's a slightly different arrangement here. At the end of the year, I was reading something on Quora, a website that I basically check every day because I'm interested in a lot of the questions and stories that people have to tell. But anyway, I was checking about that, and somebody asked something about what's the best medium for listening to music. And there was a lot to talk about if records were the best or something like that. Anyway, a person who was, I guess, a producer or an engineer went on to say that vinyl is not very good at all and went on to tell about the limitations of vinyl. But then he went on to say about how CDs are probably, I think it was 90 something percent close to what you would actually hear in the studio. Meaning basically that CDs can just hold that much more data and physically are able to store and have that sound quality much better than what you would hear on vinyl. However, there was an important point that came up, and he said that CDs were something that should have stayed in the 20th century, and the main reason was because they suffer from disc rot. I'd never heard of disc rot before, so I made some comment about that, and then he explained in response to my comment that disc rot is something that is inevitable that all CDs will suffer from. So I immediately began to worry because my CD collection, you can see a lot of it here, but I have all these, well never mind, I'm not going to drag them out now, but I have cases upon cases of CDs stored under this table here. Probably somewhere around 2,500, 3,000, I really don't know. And a lot of them are out of print CDs, some of them quite rare, some of them a little bit expensive. So I began to worry, is this something that's going to happen? And he said, yeah, within 10 years, most CDs will start to suffer from one form of disc rot or another. One of them, the common ones, is bronzing, where the silver bottom side of the CD starts turning bronze. And I think it has something to do with the oxidation of the aluminum that's inside the disc. And another thing is just you get all these like pinprick holes. So I really began to worry. And one of the first things I did was to check a disc that I have here by this Christian thrash band, Tourniquet. I think this is the original disc from Geez, my eyes are getting bad. 1990. Anyway, so I examined the disc and it's fine. So obviously, I've had this for almost 30 years now. It's still okay. But I really worried, and one of the things then I wondered is there any way to prevent it? And so I researched it, and they talked about how to store CDs. And one of the things they said, do not stack your CDs. Now, in all of the videos I've made sitting at this table here, if you've seen any of them, you'll notice I always have stacks of CDs behind me. And so one of the first things I did was to order extra cases onto the table here, which I'm not pulling out, to make sure that I could put nearly everything that I had stacked into those cases. Everything should be turned vertically. So one thing I did was these cases that I bought way back around 1990, 91, they're actually meant to be, the CDs are meant to be stored horizontally in these things, but I immediately turned them vertically. There's one here and there's one back over there. And that's not the way that these cases were meant to be, but that's just what I've done. And because of that, it meant that I couldn't set up my table the way I always had in the past. So I went and just, yeah, everything has been turned vertically now. And there were other things like humidity, rapid temperature changes. There was one guy on the internet who said he kept his CDs in a log cabin, which was pretty cold in winter, but he would heat it up with a wood stove, and he had something like, I was 40% of his discs were suffering. Things like how you handle your discs, always handle them carefully. Don't touch the top of the disc, that's actually more sensitive than the underside. If you use the wrong kind of ink when you're writing on discs, if you got to do that for some reason, damaging the top, spilling liquids on the top, even just like the paper inside the little inlay card or the booklet some of them have sulfur in. If that sulfur comes in contact with the top of the disc, it can actually leak through. Never store your discs in paper, always keep them in the jewel case, but these days a lot of digipacks are made of paper, so I'm not really sure how that's going to affect the CD, if there's any kind of precaution there. Anyway, it really had me worried, so I put something on a Facebook group for prog. I don't remember which one, like Progressive Rock Fanatics or something like that. I forget. But anyway, I did that because I know a lot of prog fans will have big CDs, big CD collections. And really the good thing was that almost everyone who actually had CDs, a couple of people responded saying, I only stream music. All right, fine. The question wasn't directed at you then. But anyway, a lot of the people who had CDs said that they have no problems. A lot of people bought their CDs in the 1980s. They said still no problems. One person said some German pressing of something that he got in 1985 had shown signs of disc rot. All his other CDs were fine. Another person said there was one disc he lent to a friend, which later on suffered from disc rot. So his advice, don't lend discs to your friends. One guy said he kept his CDs in his car, never had any problems. That's one of the things they say, like don't leave them out in sunlight, don't leave them out exposed to air and humidity, whatever. Anyway, so because I have quite a hefty investment, well, not really investment, but anyway, a lot of money is spent on getting all this stuff here, I just want to make sure that I don't have those problems as well. So if you do collect CDs or you have a CD collection, please do take care of them and try to make sure you don't have disc rot. Okay, so the idea that I actually had for the first video of the year was to pick a handful of albums that were released between the years 2010 and 2019. Now, I know we're talking about the 2010s. Officially, they end this year with 2020 because the way you count, of course, is you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're actually starting from 2011 as 1 and 2020 as 10. However, I'm going with just having a 1 in the tens place for the year. So that's 2010 going up to 2019. Just somehow feels better that way. And anyway, what else am I going to do to start the year, right? I have other stuff. I don't know. So I decided to do that, and I was thinking about what albums there are because there are just so many albums I could talk about. So I wanted to pick something that had a significant impact. Not just that I thought it was a good album, but it somehow led to other things or just meant that much more to me. And as I was thinking of the list, one of the albums that I thought about was Rush's Clockwork Angels. And this was going to be one of the albums that I was going to mention. So I was thinking about that and what to say and so on, and just the importance of Rush in particular for me, which I'll get to in a moment. However, I opened my Facebook feed this morning. What are we at here? January 11th. And the very first thing I see, Rush drummer Neil Peart, 67 years old, dead from brain cancer. And it's one of those things, it's like, there's been so much news in the last few years of people dying. We just lost Ginger Baker last year. And Canadian icons, we lost Gord Downie a couple of years back of the Tragically Hip. We lost John Mann of Spirit of the West just some weeks back, which was really shocking for me because I love Spirit of the West. Seen them in concert before, I loved them. So yeah, just to see that, it's like Neil Peart, Rush, somebody, one of the three guys from Rush. I always just thought, like, you know, the Three Amigos, the Three Musketeers, they're just a set, those three. And in some ways, they're all really lovable guys in their own ways, right? So Neil, especially because he's such an intellectual, he was such an intellectual, and I always got this warm feeling about him, like he's a very warm-hearted guy, but at the same time he's a little distant, a little timid, because he really doesn't like to just open himself up to anybody. Anyway, just really shocking news, and I immediately then went to the internet to make sure this wasn't a hoax. I mean, remember Tom Petty, right? He was announced dead before he actually died. Yeah, and it's just, that's what I found. Neil Peart, 67 years old. Yeah, so all day long, every time I opened Facebook, somewhere between 70-80% of the posts in my feed was just about Neil. So I decided that I'm going to talk about Rush Clockwork Angels here first, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Rush. They are especially important for me here when I'm going to talk about the 2010s, starting from 2010, because I always find things in music to get into. I go through periods where I just get totally into something and get lots of stuff, and then I go into a space where I'm not really sure what I'm going to be interested into next. And it so happened in 2010, the fall of 2010, I was thinking, what am I going to get into now? And I started thinking, I bought all these remastered albums of Deep Purple, and I thought, well, if there's nothing new to get into, why don't I just pick out my 25 best albums and get them all remastered? And one of them I thought about was Rush's Moving Pictures. So I went to Wikipedia and I just started reading the article about Rush. Now, I've known about Rush since the beginning. I mean, the very first cassette I ever owned was a compilation cassette of hits called Rock 82. Tom Sawyer was on it. The next cassette I owned was Bob and Doug McKenzie's Great White North with Geddy Lee on there. So I knew Rush, I knew who Geddy Lee was, and all throughout the 80s I can remember video programs and record store promotion things. There was Grace Under Pressure, there was Power Windows, there was Hold Your Fire, there was Presto, there was Roll the Bones. Rush were always there. Just I never was really interested in what they were doing on those albums during those years. I did eventually end up getting Moving Pictures, Signals, Permanent Waves, their cover album that they did, and I bought what's it called now? Shoot. Oh yes, A Test for Echo. Yeah, I even bought that one when it came out. So I thought, yeah, Rush are a cool band. I like them, but I never really got into them until I read that article back in the fall of 2010, and I was just totally amazed because I'm Canadian and I love Canadian musicians. I love to know when Canadian musicians or other Canadian actors, photographers, whatever are doing really well. And when I read about Rush, it was just like, wow, I really need to find out about this band. So yeah, I went out, I bought everything on studio album they had. I listened to nothing but Rush for 6 months. Really, for 6 months. I almost listened to nothing else. I did a little bit just to make sure that I still had interest in something else. And the thing is that learning about Rush, I learned about Yes, I learned about Genesis, and I learned about prog rock. And the funny thing is, I've listened to a lot of prog rock bands or pseudo prog rock, a lot of albums that are listed as prog rock. I had, but I never knew what progressive rock was until I got into Rush. So because of them, 2010, 2011, this whole journey of getting into progressive rock, listening to Yes and Genesis and King Crimson and all those classic bands of the 70s. I was a Pink Floyd fan since the 80s and Moody Blues too. But yeah, it just took off from there, and just everything I'm going to talk about, the starting point is Rush. So of course, we're talking 2010. They released 2 singles coming out in 2011 in a kind of promotion for Clockwork Angels, and then finally in 2012 Clockwork Angels came out. And I remember at the time I thought, if this is the last album they ever do, then they have ended on a really high note, because this is one really awesome special album. Look, there they are. Just the concept album, the whole story. I'm going to be talking about that in a future video about concept albums that I love. But there it is. And even just tonight when I was walking home, I was listening to Headlong Rush again. I love that song. That is so good. So you can see here, I was totally into Rush. I got Neil Peart's Ghost Rider book there, his tales of traveling after the tragedies he suffered there in the late 90s, the loss of his daughter and wife. Martin Popoff's book, Contents Under Pressure, 30 years of Rush, Home and Away. Neil retired from the band after 45 years, I think it was, right? Rush, Beyond the Lighted Stage, the Sam Dunn movie that they did, the documentary. This is great. And I also got the Rush Time Machine DVD because I saw some comedy short films that they did which were really bizarre and very funny. So I got that one because of that. What else do I have around here? Somewhere behind me is an old circus magazine I bought off eBay. Rush are on the cover. So yeah, and of course my 2112 shirt. I've got a Fly By Night shirt around here somewhere as well. But yeah, Rush are just the beginning of everything for me. And so even though Clockwork Angels is the end of that whole Rush chapter, this is the beginning of my journey into progressive rock, really, which leads on to progressive metal and back into heavy metal again. So Rush, these were the start of that whole new chapter in my life. Okay, so as I said, my journey in progressive rock began with Rush. I'm going to leave this up here, just, yeah. Yeah, it really was really shocking and very sad news, but I mean, I just want to add something else about Neil here. If you know about his life, I mean, he was the drummer of Rush, but what he achieved as a drummer, um, and then of course as a writer, and just all he did with all the traveling in his life and so on, I think 67 is too young to go, but he really lived a life very well. And one of the most important things I think to say about Neil's life is, in the end, with him passing away, just all day long what I saw on Facebook was constantly posts about him. It just really shows how many people adored him, appreciated him, respected him, loved him, whatever. He just made that big an impact on so many people. And I read a really cool interview with Mike Portnoy, who talked about what Neil meant to him, what his drumming meant to him. And one of the points that he made I thought was really interesting. He said that Neil just did things so differently as a drummer. It wasn't that he was just drumming and putting in fills and stuff, but it was like he was conducting an orchestra the way he played the drums. Wonderful. Anyway, let's move along now to some of the other albums in the last 10 years that have really made some kind of an impact on me. And with the beginning of my progressive rock adventures, one of the albums that really jumped out at me, was Wobbler's Rights at Dawn. Now this showed up in Amazon when I was checking out some CDs. It said, like, customers who bought this also bought these albums here. And one of them was this one. It was this lovely cover. I'll put it here. These, when I redid all this, I had to kind of just shove a lot of CDs away temporarily in places to be reorganized later on. So a lot of what I want to talk about today is kind of scattered everywhere around here behind me. So I'm just going to put the pictures up here. Wobbler's Rights at Dawn. Now, a lot of people say this really reminds them of Yes. Some people say it's too derivative of Yes. I love this album. Yes, it does have a lot of what Yes did, this kind of symphonic progressive rock, but I just feel Wobbler have their own take on it. And one of the things is that in Wobbler, they put a lot of different instruments in. You will hear flute, you will hear saxophone, sometimes you will hear strings or some other things. So that's something Yes didn't do. Yes stuck with the basic format of vocals, guitars, many different keyboards, drums, and bass. And even though what Yes did was phenomenal, I feel Wobbler are doing their own thing. And granted, they've released 4 albums so far. 3 of them kind of follow the similar kind of path in putting together an album, with usually one really long song and then 2 other mini epics and then some really short instrumental. Rights at Dawn, it had a short beginning and end piece, intro and outro, like with string section, and then it had 5 songs in the middle, running somewhere between 6 and 8 or 9 minutes long. Lots of different changes, vocal harmonies, constant movement going on in the music, lots of cool parts. Every song seemed to have like cool part and a stretch, and another cool part and a stretch, and it just left such a big impact on me. Like, this is just incredible if this is what progressive rock is, or symphonic prog. So Wobbler's Rights at Dawn is definitely one of those albums that have stayed with me. I can listen to it anytime, just put it on, and yeah, love it. So, Wobbler Rights at Dawn. Okay, next up is maybe a bit of a surprise, but it's Opeth's Heritage. It was released in 2011. I was doing my whole Rush thing in 2010, 2011, and then Yes in 2011, so I really jumped into my exploration of progressive rock in 2012, and I heard a lot about this band Opeth, so I got Heritage. It really amazed me, because at this point I'd already heard a fair bit of progressive rock bands. Some of them were newer ones like Porcupine Tree or the Mars Volta. A lot of them were the classic ones like Yes and Genesis and King Crimson and so on. Opeth's album just had something different. A lot of people said, oh, it was just too derivative of classic prog, but there was more to it than that, I felt. And one particular track, Famine, it's like Jethro Tull because it is flute. Yeah, well, flute's in a lot of progressive rock, so anyway, it just one of those songs that just stuck with me. Like, I can enjoy listening to that song every time. It just has all these really different parts to it, and then it just gets into that really heavy chord with the flute and so on, and yeah, I don't know, loved it. So Opeth's Famine was really important for me, because first, it was the first Opeth album I got. And later on I went and got Pale Communion, and then I thought, okay, I'm not really into the extreme metal stuff, but probably I should go back and just check it out. And Blackwater Park, okay, you know what? I can actually enjoy listening to this. Still Life, yeah. Serenity Painted Death, love that song. In fact, it was that song that made me appreciate death metal vocals. So from then on, I just thought, well, okay, how about their older stuff? Can I listen to it? I bought their first 2 or 3 albums, and eventually I just got all the Opeth studio albums. The latest one, I got it, I listened to it once, and then I just really carried on with other stuff, so I really haven't analyzed it well enough. But basically, Opeth were so important to me because they were the stepping stone to get me into more extreme metal. Not progressive metal, but more extreme metal. And from there on, I just really began to appreciate death metal and black metal and other types of more extreme metal. So thanks to Opeth, just this whole new doorway opened up with all these avenues that I have been merrily chasing along for the last few years now. So that's why Opeth album Heritage is just one of those very important albums for me. Alright, so another album that came out, I think it was around 2012, was Galahad's Beyond the Realms of Euphoria. This was such an interesting album for me because it had some of the elements of classic prog, plus it had a lot of really heavy guitars in it, which I really liked. And then it had all this electronic music put in, like this kind of, I don't know what you call it, but this British electronic music from the 2000s you can hear like on, what's it called now, Massive Attack or some of these other bands. It really intrigued me because some of the sounds that were produced and used in the music, it just made me feel like there was some other style of music that I can't really get into, but I can appreciate some of it, and that some of it was being put into a type of music that I can appreciate. And so I really got to loving that album for that mixture of these cool modern electronic sounds mixed in with heavy rock and progressive rock. Great album. And exactly Richelieu's Prayer 2012 I think is a phenomenal piece with classical piano, 70s classic rock, classic prog, and just lots of other things happening. It's one of those pieces, one of those songs that I think is just one of those perfect songs from start to finish. Love it. So, Galahad, that's part of the neo-prog scene from the 1980s. Of course, by then I'd already been listening to Pendragon with Pure and some of their other albums, which I also thought were great. IQ, with Frequency, and again some of their albums, and later on Road of Bones, and some other things too. But basically it was that Galahad album, and I guess also Frequency by IQ, that really opened up the whole 80s neo-prog movement from Britain for me. So I got a lot of albums from that and checked out a lot of different bands from that as well. So that album was very important and a really good welcome to that whole area of neo-prog. So Galahad's album Beyond the Realms of Euphoria is one of those albums that really stand out for me in my exploration of music between 2010 2019. Alright then, another very important album I just have to mention is Corvus Stone 2 by, of course, Corvus Stone. This was an album that was really talked about on the Prog archives. It kept appearing on the homepage a lot, and I wondered if I should get it. And then one day I got a message from the guitarist Colin Tench, who just said, I've read some of your reviews and I like what you're saying. I think you might understand my band's music, so I'd like to send you the CD if you would like to have a copy. And I couldn't believe it because it was the first time a musician contacted me and said he would send me his band's album because he thought I would like it. I mean, I read other people on Prog Archive saying that bands had sent them albums, and I thought, wow, well, they must be really important. So that was such a wonderful thing. And what that album did was to introduce me to just this whole new branch of musicians and bands, because all the first 12 episodes of Music is a Journey from 2018, just about every band I featured in those first 12 episodes are all related to Colin Tench in one way or another. I think there were maybe 2, possibly 3 exceptions. So thanks to Colin Tench, I got to know about Carabao, who are back here. I've talked about them 2 or 3 times in the videos. I got to know about Marco Ragni, who's also been mentioned, and through him, Peter Matukniak, and through Peter Matukniak and Marco Hamlet, I got to know about Murky Red, whose album No Hocus Without Pocus in 2016 is one of my favorite albums of 2016. Also an album certainly I could mention here. But I think they've got another album coming out later this year, so we'll talk about that more. The whole Melodic Revolution Records gang, there's a lot of the artists there who are from Melodic Revolution Records. And then other artists as well. I mean, it just led on to... because of Carabao, that led on to me getting to know about Sean Timms of Southern Empire and Damanik, Merrick Arnold of Damanik, and Seven Steps to the Green Door, whose album Fetish I think is brilliant, and he's in Flaming Rao, whose album Mirage, A Portrayal of Figures, I think is brilliant. He's in another band called Cyril, which is also a great band. I don't know, there's just so many artists to mention, so many bands to mention that basically start from that Corvus Stone album. And of course, the Colin Tench Project album, Hair in a G-String, unfinished but sweet. That album I actually even like more than the Corvus Stone album. And that one there also got me to know about Phil Narrow and Pete Jones. And so, I mean, basically that album from Corvus Stone, I mean, if Rush is what got me into progressive rock, if Opeth is what got me into extreme metal, then Corvus Stone is just what opened up this whole new universe of bands and artists with Melodic Revolution Records or related to artists who are on the Melodic Revolution Records label. So that album is extremely important for me in the last few years, One more album I really want to mention. I mean, there were just so many when I thought about it, and I didn't want to think too deeply because otherwise I'd make a list of like top 50. But one album that really stands out for me is Third Degree's Ones and Zeros Volume 1. Now, to keep understanding what's happening in the modern day progressive rock scene, I would often look at the Prog Archive's top 100 albums in January, of the previous year. And I would see maybe I should get like most of the top 10 anyway. And so one of the bands that showed up there, I think in 2016 it was, so 2017? Yeah, was Third Degree's Ones and Zeros Volume 1. And I found this was just really such an interesting album because I'd been reading about Ray Kurzweil's theories about the future of computer technology and where humans are going, and that humans and technology will one day kind of join up together. And I made a video about that. I think it's episode 7, possibly, where I talked about that. Third Degree's Ones and Zeros Volume 1 and Volume 0. It just really intrigued me because I'd read about it and now they were talking about it. And then the concept and what was happening in there and the kind of darker side, as well as the incredible music that they put together, the interesting lyrics that sometimes had some kind of dark cynicism to them, and then just overall vocals and everything. It was just such an interesting album. I really felt this was a band who, although they were influenced by a lot of the classic prog bands, as well as a lot of music from the 80s and 90s, just had their own take on doing music in a progressive rock kind of way. It just made such a deep impression on me. And then I was actually in hospital with appendicitis when I wrote a review about that, and then Robert Pashman, the bass player, contacted me, and we got to talking, and I mean, we've exchanged a lot of messages over the years. So that album, just one of those albums that made a deep impression on me and kind of led to things. So, fan of Third Degree here. Okay, coming to the end of it, I want to mention some albums that were released by older bands in the last 10 years here that I thought were really good. So I want to start off with Deep Purple's Now What? Now, Deep Purple, they did an album back in 2006 called Rapture of the Deep, and after that there was nothing. Like, Ian Gillan did some solo stuff, of course Steve Morse did some solo stuff, Roger Glover did some solo stuff, Don Airey did some solo stuff, but there was nothing new. And in an interview I read with, I think it was Roger Glover, he said some of the members feel it's not worth it to put on a new album because they spend much more money making the album than they actually get back from album sales. But Roger Glover, I think it was, who said that making an album is like taking a snapshot of where the band is at now. And within a year or two after that, they came out with Now What. And the interesting thing with that album was that they approached Bob Ezrin, who is a legendary producer, and they asked him to produce it. And he wasn't really keen on doing an older band. He didn't want to become known as a producer of older classic bands. But he went to see them in concert in Toronto. And afterwards he said, okay, you know what? You're going to make an album. Don't try to hit the top of the charts. Don't go for that #1 single. Make an album playing the music that you play live, because that's what your fans go to see. That's what they go to hear. That's what they want. And so Now What came out, and there were some great songs, but they put in these longer instrumental parts. And a lot of them actually, I felt, went back to the Mark I albums way back in the late 60s when Deep Purple were probably at their most progressive. And so this was actually echoed recently by somebody else who also said that Deep Purple's Now What is probably their most progressive album in a long time. So I really loved that album, and there are some songs on there, especially Blood from a Stone. I just love those songs. So I was a big Deep Purple fan in the 80s, again in the 2000s. So for me, Now What was just such a great thing to hear, that this band could put together such a fantastic album. Okay, now last year, as you know, if you watch this channel, I did 2 videos about Styx, a short one and a long one. I was not a fan of Styx before, but I really got into them last year, and of course I bought their 2017 album, The Mission, and that was their first album of new studio material since something like 2003. Anyway, it's a really good album. Now, I can't really talk about other Styx stuff because it's much older, even no matter how much I love some of the songs or some of the albums. They're older stuff from the 70s or even some from the 80s. But anyway, 2017's album, The Mission by Styx, a story about a future mission to Mars, was just such a wonderful album. And anything I read about it on any of these rock critics or music magazines on the internet, everybody just said that they've really put together a great album. And even some longtime fans who accept that Dennis DeYoung is not in the band right now or anymore, everybody just seemed to have favorable things to say about that album. So Styx's album from 2017, The Mission, is really a great album. Whether you want to accept that Dennis DeYoung is with the band or is not with the band or not, anyway, just think about it as a rock band album, and it's great. It really has that nice progressive feel, and at the same time lots of good melodies, lots of good songs. Okay, there's one other album that I can think of I want to mention, and that is by one of my favorite Canadian bands, Sloan. If you're a fan, you know about them. If you're from Canada, you probably know about them. Otherwise, you probably don't. They're one of those bands that started to make it big, and then they pulled themselves back, basically, and said, they also had some problems with record companies too, but basically they've been keeping a very healthy career going, touring in Canada and basically the US, and have not set foot outside North America for quite some time. But anyway, they released in 2012 their 20th anniversary album called The Double Cross, XX for 20, and which also was their 10th studio album. And I liked it at the time. I really liked some of the songs, but I didn't listen to it too much. And then they released a couple of more albums since then, and I think their album 12 came out in 2018, 2018. And I went back to listen to their recent albums, and that one, The Double Cross, just really got me. There are just so many songs on there that I really like. And later on I started reading what did other people have to say about it. And again, I started hearing this, that for a band that's been around for 20 years, they put together a really solid album. So, Sloan's album, The Double Cross, another really great release by a fairly old band anyway, in the 2010s. Alright, so the last band I'm just going to mention in brief is of course the Japanese band Ningen Isu. I've already made a couple of videos about them. I'm making more because I'm reading a lot of the Japanese and figuring out, things to tell the English world about, because there's not so much English information about them. But anyway, Ningen Isu, who, I said I talked about them. I now have every album. Have them all, even the rare ones that were expensive to track down. And as for the 2010s, I think it was, they just basically from the 2010s, almost every album they released. 5? 4 of the 5? Or is it 6? 5 of the 6. Just really splendid, good, kind of traditional heavy metal with a bit of the doom side and the stoner side and the prog side. Which one would I say then? Burai Hojo, I guess. I'm going to put it here so I don't have to pull it off. Probably that's the one. It was one of the first 2 albums I got, and I just really loved that one, and of course the other one. And I listened to it again a few times, and just pretty much almost every track on there I really like. So that album is really important for me because it got me into Ningen Isu, which for me right now is the band that I want to listen to the most. Though I have been listening to Rush today going to and from work, and it's been really good to hear them again. Anyway, those are some of the albums from the 2010s that really led to something else for me, or that really left me with a big impression. Of course, there are so many others I could mention, but that's enough for this video here. So thanks to everybody for watching, and Rush fans, yeah. Okay, rest in peace, Neil. Alright again, so see you in the next video. Thank you.